Scotland is just living to its promises, and we can see how it is doing now in terms of responding to that and the help that it is giving to Malawi. So we shall leave that there, and then now move on to some other news from across the continent. But we're still looking at some news affecting some countries in the continent. And still on matters, African Union and what happened over the weekend. The United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres said on Saturday that African countries are being denied needed debt relief, noting that because of lack of financial support, the African continent is facing a very difficult situation. Speaking at a news conference held at the African Union headquarters after the opening of the African Union Summit in Addis Ababa, Guterres said in order to draw on the continent's potential, a series of challenges must first be overcome. And I'll quote what he said: "A dysfunctional and an unfair global financing system that denies many African countries the debt relief and concessional financing systems and structures from health and education to social protections, job creation and gender equality are starved of investment for lack of support." Those are very key sectors in any country. So Guterres mentioned that the impact the debt has on the continent's economy in his remarks early in the day at the opening ceremony of the AU summit. He emphasized that developing countries are often left out when global investment leaders create their financial plans. African countries cannot invest in these critical areas and climb the development ladder with one hand tied behind their backs because of the debt that we owe. And then Guterres pointed out that Africa is dramatically underrepresented at the United Nations Security Council and at Bretton Woods institutions. This is quite something, and this is the noise that a few people from this continent have been making about the importance of representation. And, Guterres is clearly pointing out some of these very important, institutions in the world where important policies and important decisions are made that end up affecting the rest of us, including Africa. But Africa is not well represented in this platform. So he's saying you can see it and start discussing finding solutions and start discussing people that are not even present here and that are not even represented here. So I find these sentiments by Guterres quite interesting, because I think this has been the clarion call from a lot of Pan-Africans in this continent, because Africa right now has over 1.2 billion people, right? China has just over 1.4 billion people, so we are closer there. And yet we don't have the representation that we need at the United Nations Security Council and these Bretton Woods institutions, that is the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And yet a lot of decisions that are made there, they affect us, even how we get these loans and how indebted we become after getting these loans, whose terms and conditions seems to be very unfair to us. I think because of the risk factor that also comes from lending, to us. So Guterres is saying these areas must be looked at, and African countries cannot invest in these critical areas that he mentioned and climb the development ladder with one hand tied to their back. So they're tying our hands to their back by the heavy debts that we have, and of course that attracts quite a huge premium while we're paying back, and yet we expected to develop and to address some of these other developmental agendas that we have in our countries, and yet we cannot fully, the money that we get even for the heavy taxing that we have, the money that we have in our countries. Sorry about that. I was just thinking loud. Anyway, so we can't develop, and we can't move forward when majority of the money that we get, even from the taxes in our countries, we use it to service these debts. So very few of that, very little of that is left for us to channel towards development. So what we do is the money that we get, we service this debt, so none is left for us to focus on other things that we need in our countries. And then we are forced to go back and borrow again. So we are in an endless cycle of just borrowing and paying this heavy premium that provides debt relief and restructuring to vulnerable countries, including middle income countries, while providing immediate debt suspension and write-downs to countries in need. Oh boy, I think you just hit the nail on the head, because this is after, especially coming from COVID-19, a lot of African countries have not been in a position to service some of these loans. So there has been conversations about, do we default? Others, do we just decide that we are not going to pay, or do we restructure on how we are going to pay this debt? Because at the end of the day, you must pay. That is an agreement that your country made with these institutions, and because you belong to this international system, and that is an obligation that you are expected to meet and to respect. You're part of that bargain. And so a lot of countries have not been able to pay their debt, and this makes them so vulnerable. So others were opting for restructuring and see how they can work on modalities to still pay these debts, but also having some mitigation factors that will cushion the countries, even as we come through and go through these very difficult times financially, and see we're still able to pay, but in a way that is flexible and in a way that is still not affecting other agendas that we have in these countries. But Guterres is calling for some of these debts to be suspended, to be written off, So I think that is a good thing, and that is something a lot of countries, I think, will appreciate because they aren't able to pay. But I don't know, after we get this the suspension of these debts, are we going to work on ways where we limit our borrowing as a continent, and we focus on building our economies and empowering our small industries and empowering our manufacturing industries and empowering our agriculture sector, and just trying to live within our means? Because that has become something else that we must now think about in this continent, because you'll find a lot of these monies, they are borrowed. A good number is going to developmental agenda. We've seen infrastructural, development being done by these monies that are being borrowed from outside. But also a lot of it is lost through corruption and through public wastage and through other means that perhaps we really don't we really don't need to engage in as a country. So even as we look at the issue around debt and how we are seeking to have this suspended, if it's even possible, but also just reducing our debts, our external debts, but how can we better manage the resources that we have in our countries? I think that is the bigger debate, because there's no place that you see wastage of public funds and without accountability like you see here in Africa. Just look at these international trips that sometimes the heads of states take, and you see the number of people they're carrying with them. All these people will be given per diem. All these people will be carted for their hotels and their air transport and all these things. And you find that a lot of these people that are being carried in these entourages, they are just joyriders. They really have no responsibility and they have no part to play in this meeting. So those are things that we must look at, and we must consider how we really spend the public money. And that could be just one of the ways on cutting down on our spending and just living, within our means. And that has been our biggest problem. That has been our biggest problem. We want to pay our public service, our politicians. They get paid so much compared to other politicians in other developed countries, and yet we are not able to manage that kind of ballooning wages. So these are things that we must think about moving forward and see how best can we spend the public funds in a way that it gets to benefit the people. So as much as we are borrowing, we must be prudent. but how we choose to spend this money so that we make sure that much of it is not lost in corruption and much of it is not lost in mismanagement. So I think that is very, very important. So otherwise, even if we get this debt forgiven, the cycle will still continue if we don't change our ways and how we handle money and how we handle public money especially, and how we use it, and just basically just living within our means. Okay, so I think that is quite important. But if this is a message that the international community can receive, and Guterres, I think he must have struck a nerve there. He must have struck a nerve. Outside of the debt that he wants Africa to be forgiven and others to have to have a restructuring of how these debts are going to be paid, he also said it is about time that Africa got the representation it deserves at the United Nations Security Council. United Nations Security Council has 15 members, 5 permanent members and 10 others who are non-permanent members. And really, the non-permanent members, their positions there, it's very, I think it's just symbolic, but it really does not bear any weight, because whatever decision that has been reached there, if one of the permanent members vetoes that decision, that resolution, then it's done. It can't go through. And so we must start calling for, and I saw President Paul Kagame of Rwanda also last year calling for the same, that it is about time that Africa was given this non-permanent seat. I know how they came up and they drafted and decided it is the 5 permanent members. It's a whole story going back to the World War, and it was important for them to have all these countries that had nuclear power then for the purposes of balance of power and all that. It's a whole history. I'll not get into that. And so it's just a balance of power there for these permanent members, and we see how that is playing now wherever there is a dominating issue across the world, and that requires even perhaps voting at the United Nations Security Council or voting at the United Nations General Assembly. You see how that power balance plays out at the detriment of the rest of us in the world. Russia, being a member of a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, right now is invading Ukraine, and this war that has gone for now 2 years, and there's nothing the rest of the members can do, because whatever decision you take to punish Russia will just veto it, and there's nothing you can do about it. And Russia, China will always be siding with Russia. So we're at a place where we really don't have a voice, and our actions don't really matter, and the stance we take as countries don't really matter. I think it's about time, outside of just considering proper representation at the United Nations Security Council, they also need to look at some of these statutes as they are, because I don't think they're serving the world as they should, because it appears to shield some countries, and it appears to give more countries more impetus in how they wield this veto power and how they wield their positions in the world and in the international politics and in the international system. So I think perhaps it's time, when outside of just Africa having a position and more representation at the United Nations Security Council, which I totally agree with that, it's about time. Over 1.2 billion people, surely we deserve to have that position. But also we need to relook at how the United Nations functions, period, especially the United Nations Security Council. We need to look at some of these rules. We need to look at some of these statutes that have been in place, and we need to see, okay, fine, so how has this been working, and how can we better make sure that some of these things are not abused, as we see them being abused, and some of these things are not used as weapons to shield or to fight other people. Okay? So I think it's about time, and I agree with Antonio Guterres, that is the United Nations Secretary General, in some of these things he was talking about, and the inequality that exists when it comes to the international system. and in the global financial system that is quite unfair to many African countries, and to how it balances out, because really there's no balance. And so that was that. So they also talked about the AFCFTA, and I said this is quite a this is something that we need to properly address, because this year's theme at the United Nations Assembly, not at the United Nations Assembly, at the AU's Assembly, was AFCFTA, acceleration of the African Continental Free Trade Area. But we know the drama surrounding the Israeli representatives who had to be ejected there. That sort of overshadowed everything else that was looked at during that summit. A couple of other issues were actually addressed, and this year's theme was the acceleration of this African Continental Free Trade Area. But we are not even sitting here talking about it. Instead, we're talking about a conflict that has nothing to do with us. Between Israel and Palestine. Fine, I do understand. It's something that we can't really run away from, because we are part of that system. But surely we should learn to prioritize issues that really are of much importance, are of much urgency to us, and then when we have, we can lend our time for other things, but we should learn to prioritize on issues. So you can see this was the theme for this year's meeting, and yet we didn't get much out of what are some of the resolutions that were made, what are some of the things that were said in line with the acceleration of the African Continental Free Trade Area. And I will take my time. I'll come here and I'll explain to you what this AFCFTA means and how we stand to benefit if at all we get to a place where we can actually implement it, and how it stands to open up Africa and build economies and just build trade within the member states in the African Union. So it's a very, very important idea and institution. So once this is able to be really realized, then now we can, perhaps it will just change how we operate in this continent. But there has been some reluctance in terms of implementing it. Some countries were reluctant in even joining it, but it did take center stage at the African Union Summit this year. And matter of fact, it was the theme of this year's AU Assembly, and that was the acceleration of the African Continent Free Trade Area. And as I said, that is a conversation that I can't just have without proper details, so I will come back with the details that is necessary for us to fully understand what this means and what the continent stands to gain should this be a reality. Now, France and Burkina Faso have officially marked the end of the French military operations in the West African nation. The Burkinabe Armed Forces said on Sunday after a flag-lowering ceremony at the French Special Forces camp a day earlier, that is on Saturday. In January, Burkina Faso gave France 1 month to withdraw its troops as it ended a military accord that allowed French troops to fight insurgents on its territory, citing a wish for the country to defend itself. Their departure marks a new chapter in Burkina's battle with Islamist groups linked to Al-Qaeda and Islamic State, which have taken over large parts of the land and displaced millions of people in the wider Sahel region just south of the Sahara. In a statement, the General Staff of the Burkinabe Armed Forces said it had participated with the leadership of France's Sabri Special Forces in a solemn flag-lowering ceremony marking the official end of the task force's operation in Burkinabe soil. The French Armed Forces Ministry did not respond for a request to comment at the moment. The departure of about 400 French Special Forces from Burkina Faso follows a sharp deterioration in relations that included Ouagadougou asking France to recall its ambassador. Now, last year, protests by opponents of the French military presence increased sharply, partly due to perceptions that France has not done enough to curb the insurgency. Over the past week, a small group of anti-French protesters met each evening in Ouagadougou to watch out for signs of French withdrawal. And some of them said, we don't want the smallest second added to the scheduled date of departure. Let them leave and leave us, the Burkina Faso, the Burkinabes alone. And some of the group also held Russian flags, a sign of the complicated political undercurrents shaping the region. For both Burkina Faso and neighboring Mali, they are ruled by the military juntas, which seized power by force in the last 2 years, promising to improve security and look beyond their traditional allies for support. France withdrew its forces from Mali last year. After the junta, they have started working with Russian military contractors. Now, Ghana has accused Burkina Faso of hiring mercenaries from Russia's Wagner group, prompting Burkina's interim president to deny such forces were in the country. Understand the history of France and how it has been working with its former colonies, then partly you will understand why the people in this country, they feel they are sort of fed up with the presence of France in their countries. When you see the agreements that France had with these countries and the creation of Francafrique, sort of an initiative that's still brought together. You know, it's a similar thing that you see Britain created, the Commonwealth, which I find to be very nonsensical. Initially, it was for the former countries that were colonized by Britain. And then we have a few countries that were really not colonized by Britain, but have, have applied to be part of this, this union, in a country like France and others, and I think Mozambique. Yeah, I think. So they're part of this, yeah. So I have a problem. I've always had a problem with the psychology of this union, the Commonwealth, and I don't agree with anything it stands for, especially from where and from how it was created and how, where it emanates. And the purpose of that is to ensure that the former colonies are sort of kept together and they're still able to toe the line. And, we act like we're free and we act like, we can do whatever. But it is a means that Britain ensures that we're still together and is still able to keep an eye on us. And I just don't like it, period. I just don't like it. I don't like it. So it is the same thing that a Francafrique sort of initiative also that France had with its former colonies, similar, same thing. But the conditions of this perhaps are not very agreeable with the people now. And those days, maybe the countries, when France was leaving, they didn't have much choice. So they just needed France to give them their independence. So perhaps these terms that were spelled out in these agreements and France was leaving, they didn't have much choice. So they had to sort of agree upon, and so that they could have their independence. But what I'm saying is, we are in the 21st century. So I think these countries have every right to relook at some of these treaties and agreements that were signed during those days. They were signed under duress. I want to believe that. I don't think they were signed. No country in its right mind today would sign that. All their financial, institutions and all that will be under another country, their former colony. And their former colony will still have some rights over how they run their agenda, of how they do their things. I don't think any country in this continent would still want to be operating under such conditions. So I think instead of having attitude with France and having all these things that are happening, which I do understand, and to some extent they do have a right to act however they want to act, but also can we look at the important things, and that is those treaties, that is those agreements that you signed with France, and can you renegotiate? Can you remove those that are not serving your people? You have every right. Can you denounce some of these things? So you do it in a proper manner that relieves you from this need to be fighting for and needs to be doing in a more organized and legal manner, and see that they are able to relook at some of these agreements that were signed by their forefathers, by the people who were there at that time, who perhaps were coerced to even sign some of these treaties and agreements that now places them and forever has kept them indebted to France. So they need to look at these things and say, France, come here, come to the table. We need to have a talk. We don't want our currency to be pegged on your franc, because that is the case. All these countries that were colonized by France, all their currencies are pegged to the France's currency, and so we need our freedom in these ways. And so they have an agreement on how they want to do things. And that's how you see countries like Algeria have just decided to be spitting on France's face. The other day, when they were remaking their notes, they decided to even have some wordings in English, and France was appalled. How dare Algeria change its currency and put in some English words instead of putting some French words? And even before that, this currency did not have either English or French words, but it was written in Arabic. And so Algeria, in its renewed reforms, or in its renewed spite against France, decided to include some English words like the Central Bank of Algeria, or something like that in English. And France was appalled, and this became a debate in France's parliament. Like, how are you going to debate another independent country's decisions, and how they choose to do their things in their country, and how they choose to remodel their currency? What does that have to do with France? If Algerian authorities found that was necessary, because in Algeria most people visit and they may not be speaking Arabic, so maybe they're from English-speaking countries, and so if a currency is written in just Arabic, they may not truly understand what it's saying. So they've decided to adjust certain things, in English. But you're mad because you feel that you had a right and you needed that to be written in French, and so that became a long debate in France's parliament, and the French people there are so annoyed because of these decisions that Algeria is making. Why? Algeria is an African country. Algeria is an independent country. I know during colonialism and during that time, France treated Algeria with such preferential treatment, and Algeria was considered to be France treated it as if it was one of its provinces. So it invested so much in Algeria. It invested so much in Algeria, and I think also in another country in North Africa. And that's why you see France always feels like these people owe us, because of the many countries that were fighting and wanting their independence. So they wanted Algerians to feel like they're being treated the same way as those as the French themselves, and they were living the same life as the people from France, and they were getting the same services and all that, because they did not want a revolt from Algeria, and they did not want Algeria to start the claims of wanting to be independent. So it really did invest heavily in Algeria, with the hopes that they will not find a need to want to be independent, because they will feel like as though they will still be needing France, and perhaps they should be afraid of losing out on some of these packs that they were getting from France as their colonial masters that they had been receiving, and the kinds of preferential treatment that they were getting compared to other countries that were under French's colony at that time. In the rise of fighting for decolonization and for to gain independence, it came to a point, and Algerians were like, no, we want to have our independence, and you can keep everything else that you want to bring us here. We just want our country, and we want to be independent. And because of the heavy investment that France had done in Algeria, it always feels it has a right. And even the rest of the countries that it colonized, France always feels it has a right. The same as Britain. Of course, it does not come out overtly as we see with France, but there are some undertones there. They feel like we have a right to have a relationship with you, whether it's working or not, but we do have a right, and we want to censor this and that, and we want to but with Britain, I think it's evolving, and perhaps it's seeking for better ways. I think on this part, I will blame us here in the continent, because we don't know how to negotiate for what's best for us. We don't know how to speak for ourselves. We don't know how to demand what's rightfully ours. We don't know how to demand for what we deserve. And so if we engaged in this international system in ways that we know our value, and we know what we are worth, and we know what we are bringing to the table, and we've looked at some of these engagements that is not working for us, and we demanded for a renewed way of engaging, trust me, these countries, be it Britain, be it France, be it the US, be it China, well, China, we owe China heavily. But also, according to statistics, we actually own Western countries more than we owe China also. And the interests there are heavier compared to those we get from China. So that is also what the statistics say, which I think is quite baffling. But anyway, if we looked at what we have and decided we needed to negotiate for a better deal for us, these countries will not have a choice. And we will come to the table as equals, because we are sovereign countries. And so we have a right to sit in a table. Burkina Faso has a right to sit on the table with France as equal, and say, if you're going to have a partnership, then it's going to be a partnership. And it will not be the kind of partnership that you think you have to dominate my decision making, that you think you have to lend your hand in ways that I might not need for you to do. It has to be a relationship that is based on mutual respect and mutual aspirations and mutual goals, so that we are able to partner and work together for the better of both our countries. But we are not able to do this. So instead, what we do is we throw tantrums, like what we see now happening in Burkina Faso. So even after you've sent the French ambassador and you're making these choices, and now you have the Russian Wagner group and Mali and these other countries and the rest of other African countries, and we see the tantrum they throw against these Western leaders or these foreign powers. That is not how you get things done. That is not how you get changes, because they know how to pacify you. Once you throw these tantrums, they know what to throw at you and how to calm you down, and you will be fine. And before you know it, you've forgotten. What you need to do is to look at some of these things that are legally binding, that still binds you to these countries, but are not serving you in this current day and age. It's not for the best. It's not serving you at all. It's not serving your people. It's a disadvantage to your country. Those are the things that you need to look at and see, how can we better negotiate our position in this agreement? How can we better create a win-win situation between us and Britain, between us and France, between us and Germany, between us and whichever country we choose to work with? How can we look at these deals and see, we are both benefiting? For the Burkina Faso and for Mali, like I've said, they should go back and relook at those agreements that the forefathers entered with France, that still makes France have a stronghold on these countries, and sit down with France as grown-ups and as a mature democracies that are maturing, and say, hey, come on now, this is not working for us. We need to have another negotiation. We need to relook at this agreement, and we need to ensure that we address it, because it's not working for us as it is right now. And that way, you're really able to solve these issues. But throwing tantrums, having these mercenary groups in your country, and making other decisions, and expelling ambassadors and all that, and I do understand that it's within your full rights as a sovereign countries, but still, you have not solved the problem. Another regime might come that might be friendly to France and might welcome France back and have a more cordial relationship with France. Hey, that agreement that France signed with your country many, many years ago is still there. So France will continue this. So those are the things that we need to relook at and see, how can we wholesomely solve these problems that emitted from colonization, that some of these problems have been continued many years back and are not working for Africa. So the Operation Burkina was an anti-insurgent operation that started on the 1st August 2014 and formally ended on the 9th November 2022. It was led by French military against Islamist groups in Africa's Sahel region and consisted of roughly 3,000 strong French force, which was permanently headquartered in N'Djamena, the capital of Chad. The operation was led in cooperation with 5 countries, of which are former French colonies that span the Sahel, and that is Burkina Faso. And you've seen Burkina Faso has left that Operation Burkina, and Chad also. Chad is still there, and that's why I think it was important when President Idris Deby died. France came very quickly in Chad and ensured the son took over. And then we have Mali, and then we have Mauritania and Niger. So these countries make up the Operation Barkhane, which they had agreed upon as part of the collective in their efforts fighting against this extremist activities in the Sahel region. Mali was part of the operation until August 2022. And the countries are collectively referred to as the G5 Sahel. So these 5 countries, the Burkina Faso, Chad, Mali, Mauritania, and Niger, they make up the G5. The operation was named after a crescent-shaped dune type that is common in the Sahara Desert. Now, the French military initially intervened in Mali in early 2013. Long history. I think I attempted to explain to you what happened at that time and what necessitated for France to come in Mali under the invite of the then president. And then I think France overstayed its welcome. I think that's what happened. And as part of the Operation Civil, we successfully regained the northern half of the country from Islamist groups. Operation Barkhane was intended to follow up the success and has expanded the French military's operation over a vast area of Sahel region. That the operation has the stated aim of helping the countries and governments to maintain control of their territory and preventing the region from becoming a safe haven for Islamist terrorist groups that plan to attack France and Europe. You see? So they felt these terrorist groups that are morphing here had a plan of attacking Europe. So France felt, see, I keep telling you, there's nothing that they do in this continent that has nothing to do with how they stand to benefit. And I do understand terrorism is a global problem. But yeah, so okay, I get that. So anyway, after Mali carried out a coup d'etat in 2021, and then by Vice President Assimi Goïta, French President Emmanuel Macron announced in June 2021 that the operation would soon end and French forces would pull out. And so I think he was daring. I don't think he meant it. And before that, Malians and the new government, Assimi Goïta, said, okay, so that is what you're saying. So let's make this easier for you. So they gave ultimatums and they said, forget the deadline that you gave. We want your army out as soon as right now. So I think France was just daring them because of the importance of perhaps of this, the military that was there and the military help that France was offering. But even as France was still there, and in Burkina Faso you can see when the civilians they are protesting, and they're saying France, as much as it has had a very strong presence, and the military has had a very strong presence in this area, but it has not really helped in addressing the issue of security. You can see the protesters who were running around and carrying Russia's flag, which I think is just another story altogether. Have they not heard the stories about the Wagner mercenary group and what they're doing across the world? So we purport to want to solve one problem by creating even a much bigger problem. If Burkina Faso, as they say they want to be left out to take care of their own security. And if truly that is what Burkina Faso's army wants to do, then they should be allowed to do that. But even as we speak about Burkina Faso and its military's capability, I just saw a story about yesterday. Let me just read that to you. And the army in Burkina Faso now says more than 50 soldiers were killed in an attack by presumed Islamists in the north on Friday. It said in a statement that 51 bodies of their soldiers had been found so far. Several soldiers were still missing and 3 wounded. So as they were busy lowering the flag and giving France back its flag, and Burkina Faso receiving back its flag as they ended this operation that was meant to fight the Islamists, and in which the Burkina Faso army is saying France hasn't done much. An attack had happened against its soldiers, Burkina Faso soldiers, in the north of the country, killing over 50 soldiers. So this is not very good news. So while you say you want to take control over your security, I don't know how you're planning to do this, because after you taking over, the things have just gotten worse. So this help you're getting from Russia, what is it amounting to? What's really, really going on in Burkina Faso? So the military had earlier said on Monday that 8 had died in what it described as intense fighting with Ordolan province, and it claimed it had killed more than 100 of the assailants, though that number has not been independently verified. This year has seen an upsurge in fighting in northern Burkina Faso, with more than 100 deaths reported in the first 6 weeks. The failure to stem the bloodshed led to 2 coups last year and the ending of the French military mission to the country, the one I've really taken my time to explain to you this morning. This incident was reported as France officially marked the end of its military operation in the country. The French soldiers have been based since 2015 to help fight militants. See, so it's not getting better. Burkina Faso has to get serious with the issue of addressing this militant insurgency. I don't know, it's not just a problem that Burkina Faso can solve by itself, because it is widespread in the Sahel region, and the militants, they are operating within several countries there. So this is a problem that should worry all of us in this continent. But now the players and the actors that we invite to be part of this problem now, I don't know if they're helping or they're making things worse. So even as Burkina Faso marks the end of the French military operations in its soils, that was marked by a bloody killing of its own soldiers there by these Islamist groups there on Friday. So that is very sad there. So I'm just hoping that the country will get its act together, and they can actually find ways and means to address this issue there of insecurity, because this is really, really worrying. Okay, so that is where we come to the end of this morning's show. There are other things that I wanted for us to talk about, but I will not. I will talk about it in the show in the afternoon. UN official accuses Wagner group of abuses in the Central African Republic, the same mercenary group that is operating. Well, Burkina Faso has said that it's not operating there, but hey, group by force or under the promise that if they fight with in this group, then they will be allowed their freedom. But from the reports that we've been receiving, if you have joined this group, you can't leave, and if you attempt to leave, they just smash your head with a sledgehammer. Have you seen those reports? Very, very scary. So we should be wary, and we should be scared about the presence of this group in this continent. Okay. Thank you so much. I hope you have a good day. I'll see you here at 3 p.m. East African time. Enjoy the rest of your day. And thank you so much for watching. Bye-bye.